In a previous video, I explained that real estate wholesalers were essentially fake buyers. I gave 10 reasons why landowners who want to sell their land should not accept offers from wholesalers. Since offers from legitimate buyers and offers from wholesalers look very similar, the purpose of this video is to help you understand how to tell them apart. I will give you the inside scoop on all the clues and red flags indicating an offer is from a wholesaler. As a land seller, why should you care? You should care because you want the highest price possible for your land, and you want to minimize stress and frustration. Once you know how to tell them apart, you can entertain offers from legit buyers while rejecting offers from wholesalers. First, let's look at the situation where a wholesaler is represented by a realtor and submits an offer. The offer will be on official realtor forms for that state. The first clue that the offer might be from a wholesaler is the buyer. Wholesalers often submit offers in the name of a limited liability company or LLC and not in their own personal name. A second very important clue is the phrase "and/or assignee." This indicates they hope to assign the contract to a third-party buyer and pocket the difference. Another clue is the price they're offering. A wholesaler submitting an offer on land listed at, say, $95,000 might make a low offer, like $70,000. Wholesalers usually request a long escrow period of like 60 days. This is so they will have time to find an end buyer who will pay them more. But a real buyer might propose a far shorter period. So the proposed length of escrow is an indicator of who you're dealing with. Deposits are typically tiny, like $100, or if the deposit is larger, say $1,000. They will write into the offer that they will only submit their deposit after removing all contingencies, which is pretty much equivalent to no deposit at all. In contrast, a normal deposit from a real buyer is around 3% of the purchase price, wired to escrow within 3 days. Wholesalers will need a long contingency period inside their long escrow. They might write in their offer something like 59 days. So you can see why submitting a deposit after removing contingencies, the day before closing escrow, offers no security for the seller. They are trying to get away with no skin in the game. On the other hand, a normal contingency period from a real buyer is like 17 days. So now you're wondering, how can I figure out if this offer is from a wholesaler or a real buyer? I've pointed out several clues, but how can you know for sure? Maybe you're wondering, why can't I just ask them? Well, that won't work because a wholesaler will not tell you straight out. They'll give you a lot of indirect and insincere answers. The best way to figure out the buyer's true identity is to give them a strategically drafted counteroffer and see how they respond. Write it in such a way that a wholesaler will walk away, but an actual buyer may accept. Then you'll have your answer. Here's how I advise my sellers to counteroffer. There are 5 items in this counteroffer, so let me go over them with you one at a time. First, I recommend that you tell the buyer that they cannot assign the contract during escrow. A wholesaler will find that a total deal breaker, while a cash buyer will say, "That's fine." Second, I recommend that you ask them to wire a large deposit to escrow within 24 hours of a signed contract. Wholesalers hate putting down large deposits because they're worried they won't find an end buyer. Then they'll have to cancel and they may not get their deposit back. But a real cash buyer who is fairly certain they will close on the deal won't mind because the deposit is applied to the purchase price at the end anyway. Third, tell the buyer that they can have no contingencies except clear title. Since they're wiring a deposit to escrow within 24 hours, you're essentially telling the wholesaler that if he cancels because he could not find an end buyer, he will lose his large deposit. Like the other clauses, this one will cause a wholesaler to disappear, which is what you want, while a real cash buyer may agree to this condition. Fourth, require them to close escrow in 2 weeks. A wholesaler will not have time to find an end buyer and close in that period, but a genuine buyer with cash on hand can easily do that. Finally, advise the buyer that before you agree to go forward, you need them to prove they have the funds. A cash buyer will send over a screenshot of their bank account showing their name and the balance, but a wholesaler may not have the funds. So they will try to get one over on you by sending a form letter from a hard money lender or something like that. These letters are often generated in minutes on the internet, so they are not worth anything. One time, I tested out one of these sites by asking for a pre-qualification letter for the most expensive mansion in Beverly Hills. And the letter was in my inbox within minutes, so you can see what these letters are worth. Not much. I've explained how to respond to an offer from a wholesaler submitted through a realtor on the agent's official forms. Now, let's take a look at some contracts that wholesalers use when there is no realtor involved. As an overview, this is what they look like. These contracts look similar to one another and contain many of the same clauses. One clause that virtually all of these contracts contain is a clause allowing the wholesaler to assign the contract to a different buyer during escrow. Let's go through some examples of assignment clauses. I want to show these to you so that you can recognize them when you get an offer like this. Here's the most common way a wholesaler will state, indirectly, that they are likely to assign the contract to another buyer. They will indicate that the buyer is the wholesaler's LLC and/or assigns. Note that the word assigns is not just typed in as it was on the realtor forms. It is boilerplate. This is a clear red flag that you're dealing with a wholesaler, not a real buyer. Here's another example. This one is also boilerplate, and another, and yet another. This one does not say assigns, it says assignee. You might also see the words nominee or designee. The wholesaler is planning to transfer the contract to another person. Now here's an example of an assignment clause that appears later in the contract, not at the top where the buyer is named. This clause makes it clear that the buyer has the right to assign the contract to a third party at any time they want, without seeking the seller's permission. This clause states that the buyer may assign the contract if the buyer is unable to secure financing. This is a tell that the buyer does not have sufficient funds sitting in their bank account. Here's a clause stating in a simple fashion that this contract is assignable by the buyer, and another one stating that the buyer can assign their rights, and a third party would then close directly with the seller. Now let's turn to a different topic. Since wholesalers are not buyers, they must find an end buyer during escrow. This means they will need easy access to the house or land to allow potential buyers to tour the property. Note that actual buyers have no interest in sending other buyers through the property, so real buyers will not include this clause in their offer. This is a second way you can suss out whether they are a wholesaler or a buyer. Here is a typical access clause. Between contract date and close of escrow, seller grants buyer and/or buyer's employees, inspectors, partners, investors, contractors, and/or agents full access to the property. The wholesaler even asks to install a lockbox with a key, like he's a realtor or something. Note that words like inspectors, partners, investors, contractors, and agents are often just code for end buyer. Here's a case where he misleadingly refers to end buyers as representatives. And finally, here's a case where the wholesaler boldly asks that access be allowed 24 hours a day. I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but real buyers rarely need access for so-called partners or investors, and certainly would not ask for 24-hour access. So this is another way you can tell a wholesaler from an actual buyer. Now let's talk about how wholesalers commonly include clauses that allow them to cancel for any reason and get their deposit back. Here's a cancellation clause that says the buyer will have the absolute right to cancel this agreement for any reason whatsoever at buyer's sole and absolute discretion. And if he cancels, the buyer gets his entire earnest money deposit back. What's the point of an earnest money deposit if it must be returned to the buyer in all cases, including when the seller finds out the buyer has no money, or when the buyer cancels the day before he's scheduled to close escrow? In this example, the wholesaler is saying that the deposit is refundable if title does not transfer. Note that if the buyer cancels, title will not transfer. So this is a sneaky backdoor way of saying that the buyer can get his deposit back regardless of the reason he cancels. And finally, when there is a cancellation in California, the escrow officer will require both the buyer and seller to sign an additional form agreeing where the deposit should go. This is because escrow is neutral, so all instructions to escrow must be bilateral. The purpose of this clause is to allow the wholesaler to get around that. The wholesaler is saying here that the escrow officer can unilaterally decide to return the deposit to the buyer, even if the seller disagrees. Wholesalers are likely to cancel and are afraid they won't get their deposit back when they do, whereas real buyers are likely to close escrow, so they are not worried about their deposit. This kind of clause is another clue that this person is a wholesaler. How can you tell a wholesaler from a real buyer? Based on their financing clause. Well, the first clue is that there even is a financing clause. Cash buyers don't need a financing clause because, well, they're paying cash. Wholesalers will say they're purchasing with cash, but let's look at how they define it. This wholesaler says in his offer that cash might include funds from their investors, partners, and/or unconventional lending sources. Sorry, but in real estate, that's not the definition of cash. Cash consists of funds in your bank account or under your mattress. Cash might also be obtained from your own personal investment funds, a home equity line, or a cash advance on your credit card. Cash is not money you get from a third party, such as a theoretical end buyer, and it is not money from a lender, even a hard money lender. This is because these sources of funds are not 100% certain when the offer is submitted. Defining cash in a misleading way is a red flag that the person submitting the offer does not have liquid cash and is a wholesaler, not a buyer. This wholesaler is saying directly that the purchase is contingent on securing funding. In other words, they don't have the funds now. They will try to obtain the funds. In contrast, genuine buyers who say they are paying cash already have funds. Genuine buyers do not market land they do not yet own. Even flippers and investors who buy land intending to resell it weeks, months, or years later do not market it during escrow before they even own it. They would wait and advertise it after they're the legal owner. So when you see a marketing clause, that's a sure sign the offer is from a wholesaler. For example, this wholesaler is telling the seller that he will market it before closing. Here, the wholesaler is saying they will display the property on public websites and databases. This wholesaler says they will advertise the property. This one says they want to market it not only for sale, but also for rent. And finally, this wholesaler wants to put a physical sign on the property. Now let's talk about a special clause they include in the offer regarding other buyers. As a land broker, I can tell you that when a real cash buyer has a signed purchase agreement with a landowner, they understand that this is a binding agreement and do not express worry that the owner will go behind their back and sell it to someone else. That's not really a thing. However, wholesalers apparently have a lot of sensitivity and fear around this issue because they include special clauses regarding competing buyers in their contracts. When you see one of these clauses, you're likely dealing with a wholesaler. This wholesaler wants to make it crystal clear that the seller cannot enter into a purchase agreement with anyone else. This one prohibits the transfer of the property to another buyer. This wholesaler is advising the seller that once they are under contract, the seller cannot just accept a better offer and kick them to the curb. The seller can only treat a new offer as a backup offer and sell to the new buyer only if the wholesaler decides not to purchase. And lastly, this distrustful wholesaler wants to take the step of actually recording an affidavit of memorandum on the property before they own the land. This is a public record filed with the county clerk's office. The purpose is to provide notice to anyone else who tries to take the deal from them that they have a valid contract, and the new buyer should back off. So remember what our goal is here. As landowners, we want to figure out if any offer we receive is from a real buyer or a wholesaler. The reason we want to know that is so that we can decline a wholesaler's offer, but consider the offer if it's from a genuine cash buyer. Let me remind you of some words that are red flags. Words like assign, assignee, nominee, designated entity, partners, investors, representatives, and third party are all code for end buyer. And remember, an end buyer is the person the wholesaler will look for. His goal is to get a higher offer from an end buyer to pocket the difference. As for red flags in the offer itself, look at whether the buyer is an LLC. Now, legit buyers also use LLCs, but in my experience, that's only about 20% of the time. Wholesalers use LLCs maybe 80% of the time, so it's a clue. Also, look for a surprisingly high or low offered price. Check the deposit too. If it's exactly $100, that's a clue. If it's more, read the fine print to see if they plan to submit it only after removing contingencies, not immediately like a typical buyer would. Look for language that suggests they can easily cancel and get 100% of their deposit back for pretty much any reason. Note whether the proposed escrow period is excessively long, 45 days or more, and whether the contingency period is almost as long as the escrow period. Do they want easy access so that they can parade people through? And do they want to market the property during escrow? Have they shown you a bank statement with their own name on it as proof that they have the funds ready to go? Or is there no evidence that they have the cash, and the offer contains mumbo-jumbo about finance partners, hard money loans, etc.? Do they include a paragraph about how you cannot change your mind after signing their offer and sell to another buyer? Of course you can't, because you have a signed agreement. But in my opinion, as a non-attorney, explicitly spelling this out shows undue sensitivity to the obvious, and, more importantly, is a red flag that they are a wholesaler. If you ask, "Are you a wholesaler?" Or suppose you ask, "Why would you assign the contract?" Or maybe you ask, "Why do you need so long to close escrow?" Here are a few phrases that he might use. "I have multiple LLCs, and I'm not sure which one I want to take title in." Or, "I work with a large network of buyers and investors." Or he might say, "I might bring in some of my cash partners." Or, "I will need time to free up some funds." Or, "I have multiple exit strategies." Now, what if you make a mistake and accept an offer from a buyer that you later suspect might be a wholesaler? Well, you can still look for red flags, even during escrow. Wholesalers often fail to submit their deposit, so that's a possible indicator. One time, before I wised up, a wholesaler submitted an offer on one of my land listings, and the seller accepted his offer, thinking he was a genuine buyer. Then the wholesaler asked me, the listing agent, to completely remove my marketing during escrow. Usually, I would mark it pending or in escrow and leave it up, but he wanted it gone from the web entirely. This is when I realized he was a wholesaler, and he did not want his end buyers to see what they could have bought it for. Maybe you discover that your land is being marketed on the MLS or other websites without your permission. That's an indicator. Some wholesalers request a limited power of attorney to sell the land, a scary prospect, and also a clue. If you find that many so-called partners are touring the property, or if he tries to renegotiate the price or the closing date, these are also clues. And finally, if he assigns the contract to a third party, it will be too late, but then you will know for sure what the deal is. Now that you know all the red flags, what can you do when you suspect the offer is from a wholesaler? If you catch the red flags early and you're 100% sure it's a wholesaler, then it's easy. Just decline the offer. But what if you're only 80% sure? Then you should give them the counteroffer that I showed you previously. Write it in such a way that a wholesaler will head for the hills, but a real buyer will accept it, or maybe push back on a couple of items. If you mess up and sign to accept the offer, but you later want to get rid of them, there are still steps you may be able to take. I'm not an attorney, so discuss the following ideas with your attorney before you act. If he does not submit a deposit, give him a 48-hour notice to perform. If he fails to perform, you can cancel. Or if he asks to lower the price, extend the time periods, give him power of attorney, or take down the listing agent's MLS advertising, or anything else that is not in the agreement you signed. You can be uncooperative, or you can simply say no. That will likely cause him to cancel. These are some ideas to discuss with your attorney on how you can get out of a bad deal. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps you identify offers from real estate wholesalers so that you can decline them and save time, money, and aggravation when selling your land.